Have you ever wondered why people stand in massive lines for a brand new phone, even when the one they already own works perfectly fine? Or why someone would spend thousands of dollars on a handbag, a watch, or a pair of sneakers? At first glance, it just looks like consumerism, but something much deeper is happening beneath the surface. The biggest brands in the world don't just sell products, they sell emotion, status, identity, and most importantly, belonging. And maybe the scariest part is realizing that most people don't even notice they're being influenced, because when we look at the modern world, it feels like we're surrounded by objects, but in reality, we're surrounded by symbols. Simple logo can completely change the way someone is perceived. A smartphone can signal power, a watch can signal success, a handbag can communicate status without a single word being spoken. Because consumption was never just about utility. Human beings buy meaning, they buy feelings, they buy social perception, and very few things are more powerful than the human need to be accepted. Maybe that's why certain brands create almost unbelievable levels of obsession. People sleep outside stores for launches, pay insane amounts of money, defend companies as if they were part of their own family, and the craziest part? Most of them genuinely believe they're making completely rational decisions. But the biggest brands in the world know that's rarely true, because the human brain is far more emotional than we like to admit. Most of the time we feel first and justify later. We desire first, and then invent logical reasons to explain the desire, and that's exactly where the real psychological game of billion-dollar brands begins. Everything is carefully engineered. The colors, the prices, the packaging, the advertisements, the music inside the stores, even the way products are displayed. Nothing happens by accident, because the most powerful companies on earth spend billions studying one thing: how to control human attention and desire. And maybe that sounds exaggerated at first, but think about it for a second. Why can two nearly identical products have completely different prices just because one carries a specific logo? Why do people automatically associate certain brands with success? And why does owning certain objects make people feel more important? The answer lies in social psychology. Since the earliest days of human civilization, status has always been tied to survival. The people with more resources had more respect, more influence, more power inside the group. And even though we live in a modern society, our brains still carry many of those same primitive instincts. We still crave recognition, we still crave admiration, we still want to feel like we belong to something bigger than ourselves, and brands understand this perfectly. That's why they don't just sell physical products, they sell idealized versions of life itself. When someone buys a product, they're often not buying functionality alone, they're buying the feeling of being more sophisticated, more modern, more desired, more important. And that creates an incredibly powerful emotional connection. Because when consumption mixes with identity, the product stops being just a product, it becomes an extension of personality. Maybe that's why some people feel an almost emotional need to own certain items, not because they truly need them, but because they believe those objects represent who they are, or who they want to become. And that's the silent secret behind billion-dollar brands. They don't just dominate markets, they dominate perception. They dominate desire. They dominate human behavior. And the more emotional the connection between brand and consumer becomes, the more powerful that company gets, because at that point, it's no longer selling products, it's selling meaning. And maybe that's the most profitable form of influence ever created in the history of modern consumerism. There's an idea that feels uncomfortable the moment you hear it. Most people believe they make buying decisions rationally. They think, I bought it because it was better, because the quality was higher, because it made sense. But the biggest companies on earth understand that the human brain doesn't actually work that way. First, we feel. Then we justify. First, we desire emotionally. Then we use logic to convince ourselves the decision was rational. And once you understand that, the entire world of consumerism starts looking completely different. Because deep down, most purchases don't happen because people truly need something. They happen because a product triggers a powerful emotion. Maybe it's status, maybe it's exclusivity, maybe it's belonging, and that last one might be the strongest of all, because the desire to belong is deeply wired into human nature. Since the earliest days of civilization, survival depended on being part of a group. If you were accepted, you had protection, security, social importance. But if you were excluded, you became vulnerable. And even though we live in a modern world, our brains still carry those same emotional survival mechanisms. We constantly seek social approval. We want admiration, recognition. We want to feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And billion-dollar brands understand this perfectly. That's why they don't just create customers, they create tribes. And the moment a brand successfully creates a tribe, it stops selling products alone. It starts selling collective identity. Think about some of the biggest companies in the world. Many of them have incredibly loyal fan bases. People who defend the brand emotionally attack. Competitors stand in line for launches, feel genuine personal pride in owning certain products, and that doesn't happen because of quality alone. It happens because those brands started representing something emotionally important. When someone wears a specific sneaker, watch, phone, or drives a certain car, they're often communicating a silent message about themselves. I'm modern, I'm successful, I belong to this group. And the stronger that emotional connection becomes, the more powerful the brand gets, because at that point, it's no longer competing on price or functionality alone. It's competing on psychological meaning, and psychological meaning is incredibly difficult to copy. Maybe that's why some companies can charge absurd prices for relatively simple products, because consumers aren't just paying for the physical object, they're paying for the emotion attached to it, the social feeling it creates, the identity it represents, and brands know exactly how to strengthen that feeling. They use celebrities, influencers, online communities, exclusive events. Everything is designed to reinforce one idea. Buying this brand means becoming part of something special. It's almost like an invisible social club, and the more exclusive that club feels, the stronger the desire to enter it becomes. That's why people sometimes buy things they can barely afford, because emotional desire often speaks louder than financial logic. The need for social acceptance can be unbelievably powerful, far more powerful than most people realize. And maybe the most fascinating part is understanding that all of this is studied with incredible precision. The world's largest companies spend billions researching human behavior. They analyze emotions, habits, desires, insecurities, because understanding psychology means understanding consumption, and understanding consumption means understanding money. At the end of the day, the most powerful brands on earth don't just dominate markets, they dominate human desire. And as long as people crave belonging, recognition, and status, there will always be companies capable of turning emotion into billions. There's a moment in the evolution of every powerful brand that changes everything. It's the moment when the company stops selling a product and starts selling identity. And maybe that's the most powerful business strategy ever created. Because when people buy something purely for its function, the decision is usually rational. But when people buy identity, the decision becomes emotional. And emotions create far stronger connections than logic ever could. Think about how many times you've instantly assumed something about a person just because of the brand they were wearing. A watch, a car, a phone, a pair of sneakers. Without even realizing it, our brains constantly associate products with human characteristics. That person looks wealthy. That person seems modern. That person has status. And that's exactly where the biggest brands operate. They transform objects into social symbols. And the stronger that symbol becomes, the more powerful the brand becomes, because at that point the product stops being functional. It becomes an extension of personality. Maybe that's why some people defend companies with such emotional intensity. Sometimes it almost looks irrational. People argue about brands as if they're defending their own identity. But in reality, that's exactly what's happening. Because when someone spends years associating a brand with their personal image, criticism of the product can start feeling like criticism of the person themselves. That's why some companies create unbelievably loyal customers. not simply because they have the best products, but because they built a deep emotional connection, a connection rooted in identity. The smartest brands in the world understand something fundamental. Human beings consume symbols far more than objects. Luxury sneakers aren't just for walking. Expensive watches aren't just for telling time. Sports cars aren't just for transportation. These products communicate silent messages about who someone is, or who they want to become. And that completely transforms modern consumerism. Because in this world, buying stops being a practical necessity. It becomes social construction. Every purchase becomes a piece of someone's public identity. And companies exploit this brilliantly. They connect their brands to specific lifestyles: freedom, power, success, rebellion, exclusivity, youth, minimalism. Every detail is carefully engineered to create a specific emotional association. And the stronger that emotional bond becomes, the harder it is for consumers to walk away from the brand. Because abandoning the brand can feel like abandoning part of themselves. Maybe that's why some people feel genuine emotional pride when buying certain products. It's no longer just about owning something. It's about what that object represents. A handbag can represent status. A car can represent achievement. A phone can represent modernity. And a brand can represent belonging. Companies know this incredibly well. That's why they spend billions building emotional narratives. Commercials don't just sell products. They sell feelings. They sell idealized versions of life. They sell the feeling of who you could become by owning that brand. And this strategy works with frightening efficiency, because human beings naturally want to build a positive social image. We all want to be perceived a certain way: smarter, more sophisticated, more successful, more desirable. Brands simply provide visual symbols to communicate those things. And maybe the most fascinating part is realizing that most people don't even notice this influence happening. They believe they're making completely free choices, but in many cases, the desire was carefully constructed long before the purchase ever happened, through advertising, culture, celebrities, influencers, social media, everything working together to connect specific products to specific emotions. And when that emotional association becomes strong enough, the product stops being just an object. It becomes identity. And maybe that's exactly why some brands become nearly impossible to defeat, because competing on price is easy. Competing with human identity is an entirely different game. There's a psychological technique so powerful that billion-dollar companies use it every single day, and most people never even notice. Scarcity. It sounds simple, but very few things influence human behavior more than the feeling that something is about to disappear. Only a few left, limited edition, available today only. At first, these just sound like marketing phrases, but in reality, they activate incredibly deep mechanisms inside the human brain, because the brain hates losing opportunities. And that's exactly where one of the most powerful triggers in modern consumer psychology comes into play. FOMO, fear of missing out, the fear of being left out, the fear that someone else might get something before you do, and that fear can push completely rational people into making impulsive decisions within seconds. You've probably experienced this without even realizing it. You visit a website with no intention of buying anything, then suddenly a message appears. Only 2 left in stock, and instantly the product feels more important, more valuable, more urgent. Your brain immediately changes the way it reacts, because when something feels abundant, we assume we can always buy it later. But when something feels rare, emotional pressure takes over, and billion-dollar brands exploit this brilliantly. They intentionally limit supply, create exclusive editions, release products in small drops, and transform ordinary items into emotional events. Think about how many times people have stood in line for hours to buy sneakers, stayed awake all night waiting for a phone launch, or rushed to buy something simply because everybody else was buying it. Most of the time, the desire isn't created by the product alone, it's created by scarcity, because the harder something feels to obtain, the more valuable it becomes inside the human mind. It's almost primal. For thousands of years, survival depended on securing scarce resources before other people did. Food, shelter, protection. And even in the modern world, our brains still react emotionally to the idea of a last chance. Companies know this. That's why some brands intentionally create artificial scarcity. They could produce more, they could sell to more people, but instead they choose to limit access, because exclusivity creates desire, and desire creates profit. Maybe no industry exploits this more aggressively than luxury. Limited handbags, exclusive watches, rare sneakers, products that feel almost impossible to obtain. And the rarer the item appears, the higher the status of the people who own it. At that point, the product stops being just an object. It becomes social proof. A symbol of privileged access, a silent way of saying, I got something most people couldn't, and that feeling is incredibly powerful for the human brain, because exclusivity creates a sense of importance. But there's an even darker layer to this strategy. Sometimes scarcity increases desire, even when the product itself isn't particularly special. The simple fact that something feels rare automatically changes how we perceive its value. That's why people spend fortunes on limited edition items. Not just because of utility, but because of the psychological feeling of owning something exclusive, and brands know exactly how to intensify that feeling. Countdown timers, secret launches, waiting lists, exclusive invitations, everything designed to increase emotional tension. Because the more anxiety people feel before the purchase, the stronger the desire usually becomes. And when millions of people compete for the same product, something even more powerful happens: social validation. If that many people want it, it must be valuable. The brain automatically associates popularity with importance, and that's how the cycle keeps growing. More desire, more exclusivity, more scarcity, more profit. Maybe that's why some companies can turn ordinary products into global phenomena simply by controlling access. Because at the end of the day, human beings naturally want what feels difficult to obtain, and very few strategies are more profitable than convincing people they might lose an exclusive opportunity. Because once the fear of missing out takes over, logic almost always loses to emotion. There's something fascinating about modern luxury. Most people believe luxury products are desired simply because of quality. But the truth goes much deeper than that, because in many cases, the product itself stops being the most important part. The real value is perception. A luxury watch doesn't just sell time, an expensive handbag doesn't just sell storage, and $1 million car doesn't just sell transportation. These products function as social symbols. They communicate status, wealth, influence, and power without saying a single word. And maybe that's exactly what makes luxury so powerful, because human beings have always searched for ways to signal social position. Since ancient civilizations, people used clothing, jewelry, and rare objects to demonstrate importance inside society. Modern luxury simply transformed that instinct into a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the biggest brands in the world understand this perfectly. That's why they don't just sell functionality, they sell social meaning. When someone wears a certain watch, they're often not just checking the time. They're silently saying, I'm successful. I belong to an exclusive circle. I've reached a certain level in life. And all of this happens without words. It's almost like an invisible language between people. Those who understand the symbols instantly recognize the status certain brands communicate. Maybe that's why luxury depends so heavily on public perception, because a product only works as a status symbol if other people recognize the symbol itself. And companies spend billions building exactly that perception. Celebrities wearing the products, influencers showcasing luxurious lifestyles, exclusive events, sophisticated campaigns, everything carefully designed to connect that brand to success, desire, and power. Because the more emotionally connected a brand becomes to the concept of status, the more valuable it becomes. And that creates something incredibly interesting. The high price stops being a problem. In many cases, it actually becomes part of the attraction. Because in the luxury world, exclusivity is everything. If everyone can easily buy something, part of its symbolic value disappears. Luxury needs to feel rare, distant, difficult to access, And the fewer people who can obtain it, the higher the perceived status of the people who do. That creates an incredibly powerful psychological cycle. People see influential individuals wearing a brand. They associate it with success. They start wanting the same symbol, and the brand becomes even stronger. But there's an even deeper layer to this entire system. Many times, consumers aren't just buying an object. They're buying a narrative about themselves, an idealized version of their own identity. The watch represents achievement. The car represents power. The handbag represents sophistication. And every product becomes part of someone's social image. That's why luxury consumption is rarely rational. Because rationally, many ultra-expensive products make very little sense. But emotionally, they make perfect sense, because they satisfy ancient human desires. Recognition, admiration, social importance, belonging. And the biggest brands know exactly how to exploit those desires. They transform consumption into social language. Every product becomes a silent way of communicating who you are or who you want to become. Maybe that's why some people feel such intense emotions towards certain brands. They're not just buying physical objects. They're buying feeling.image perception. And that creates an almost endless cycle of desire, because there will always be someone trying to appear more successful, more influential, more exclusive, more admired. And as long as those desires exist, luxury will remain one of the most powerful industries on earth. Because at the end of the day, true luxury was never just about owning expensive things. It was always about owning symbols that make other people see you differently. Maybe the scariest part of this entire story is realizing that the biggest companies on earth aren't just selling products. They're selling feelings, they sell dreams, they sell status, they sell idealized versions of human identity. And they do it with incredible precision. Nothing happens by accident. Every detail is carefully engineered to trigger specific emotions inside the consumer's mind. The colors of the packaging, the design of the stores, the scent inside the room, the music playing in the background, the faces chosen for advertising campaigns, even the silence inside certain luxury boutiques, is part of the psychological experience. Everything is intentional, because the most powerful companies in the world discovered something incredibly valuable. Whoever controls emotion controls desire, and whoever controls desire controls billions. Maybe that's why so many brands feel almost addictive. They study human behavior at an astonishing level of depth. They know which words create urgency, which images trigger envy, which symbols communicate exclusivity, which emotions increase impulsive behavior. It's almost like an invisible science of consumption. And the craziest part? Most people believe they are completely in control of their own decisions. But in reality, the desire often starts long before the purchase ever happens. It starts in an advertisement on social media, through an influencer, through silent comparison with other people. Because human beings are constantly observing the social environment around them, and brands exploit that brilliantly. They create the feeling that certain products represent success, happiness, acceptance, social importance, and when a company successfully connects a product to emotions that deep, the object stops being just an object. It becomes a psychological symbol. Maybe that's why some people experience such intense emotions when they consume. The purchase stops being rational. It becomes emotional, almost personal. And that creates something incredibly powerful. Recurring emotional consumption. Because emotions are never satisfied for very long, human desire always searches for a new target, a new symbol, a new product capable of creating the feeling of status, belonging, or recognition. And companies know this. That's why the market constantly creates new trends, new versions, new launches, new desires. The goal isn't just to sell something once. The goal is to keep consumers emotionally connected forever. And maybe that's the darkest truth about modern consumerism. Many times, people aren't buying because they need something. They're buying because they're trying to fill invisible emotions, insecurity, the need for acceptance, the desire for admiration, the fear of falling behind. and that transforms consumption into something far bigger than simple shopping. It transforms consumption into identity, construction. Maybe that's why some brands survive for decades while selling products that are unbelievably expensive, unnecessary, or even irrational. Because at the end of the day, they're not selling logic, they're selling emotion, and emotions are infinitely more powerful than rational arguments. But here's the most important detail of all. That doesn't necessarily mean brands are evil. In reality, they simply learned how to exploit human desires that have always existed. The desire for belonging, the desire for recognition, the desire to feel important. And as long as those desires remain part of human nature, there will always be companies capable of turning psychology into billions. Maybe that's exactly why some brands feel almost impossible to destroy, because they don't just occupy space in the market, they occupy space inside people's minds. And once you truly understand that, you start seeing advertising, luxury and consumerism in a completely different way. You realize that behind every campaign, there's psychology. Behind every trend, there's strategy. And behind every billion-dollar brand, there's a deep understanding of human behavior. Maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. The most powerful companies in the world don't just sell better products, they sell better feelings. And as long as emotions continue driving human decisions, brands will continue turning desire into billion-dollar empires. Now think about this for a second. How many of the things you want today did you truly choose to want? And how many were carefully designed to feel irresistible? Because once you understand the psychology behind billion-dollar brands, you'll never look at consumerism the same way again. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe to Profit and Peril, and turn on notifications, because here we uncover the hidden mechanisms behind money, power, and the companies that shape the modern world.